What's going on, you guys? It's your boy Bill Mahari here, representing Mahari Nation Sports Podcast. Much love to the entire LDBC and the basketball community. If you want more basketball content, tune in to Basketball Conversations every Friday night, 9 p.m. Central Time. This is where we discuss basketball-related topics, news, debates, and everything else in the world of basketball. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to get all your latest notifications when I start dropping videos and live streams. All right, let's get down to business, shall we? So I had a chance to really, think about in my basketball encyclopedia mind of mine, as I always like to do every day. I thought to myself, what really happened in the aftermath of the Seattle Supersonics when they made the 1996 NBA Finals. Okay, now to reflect back about the Sonics. Okay, the Sonics during the 95-96 season won a franchise best 64 regular season games, surpassing the 63 games that they won in 94. All right. That team in 96 won 30 of their first 36 games, after the All-Star break. Okay. They were led by Defensive Player of the Year, Gary Payton, power forward, Shawn Kemp. They also had versatile small forward, Detlef Schrempf, sharp shooting guard, Hersey, Hawkins. And then also they had, decent center Irvin Johnson, but then their backup was the sharpshooting big man Sam Perkins in their front line. Okay, you also had Nate McMillan, who was also a good defensive point guard there too, that can play both the two and the point guard position. You also had Vincent Askew, who also was a good defensive player there too, as well. You also had Frank Bukowski, who was also a stretch four, who could pretty much stretch the floor and shoot the three, from long range too. So this was the type of team that was very, versatile. Then he also had David Wingate, who was also another defensive, player too, that can play the three or the two as well. Now, when you really look back at that Sonics team after that year, okay, that team, succeeded beyond their expectations, but there were some key things that they wanted to improve upon, and one of the key areas that they wanted to fix was their center position, and right up until the during the offseason, okay? Shawn Kemp, their star player, signed a contract extension. He's basically signed a contract extension that helped make his contract at least about additional $20 million, okay? Basically from the $26 million that he basically was making of his first contract, okay? That's the deal that he signed, a 6-year deal that was back in 1989, okay? Now, during that 96 NBA Finals, okay? So as we look back at that 96 NBA Finals here, as I go ahead and pull this up just real quick. So the way that this went down during the NBA Finals, okay? Shawn Kemp was averaging 20.9 points per game throughout the entire postseason, okay? Now, during the NBA Finals, okay? During that particular series, okay? Shawn Kemp balled out. He averaged 23.3 points per game, grabbed 10 rebounds, shot 85% from the free throw line, and also went through a stretch when he made 15 in a row from the free throw line. Okay. And he was shooting 55% from the field too as well. So pretty much Shawn Kemp, if the Sonics would have ended up upsetting the 72-10 Bulls, he would have easily won the finals MVP based on how he was performing. And in fact, you could pretty much make the case that was Shawn Kemp's best season, okay? He was basically playing the best basketball of his entire career up in that point. He was only about 20. He was 26 years of age. He was still at his peak. He was averaging 19.6 points per game during the regular season and doubled that, during the NBA Finals, okay? Now, basically up until that offseason, okay, he signed an extension, right? But he wanted a raise in his contract, which he rightfully deserved it because he basically was performing up to beyond his regular season, averages. But the thing was that the collective bargaining agreement at the time basically forbid any team to make any adjustments to to any player's contract up until October of 1997, and he was not happy about that, despite his agent basically, telling him and trying to make him understand about that rule. Okay. But what made things even worse, though, at the time was the Sonics made a horrible decision by signing bum center Jim McIlvaine to at least 7 years and $33 million. That was the beginning of the end for the Seattle Supersonics, because you basically explained to Kemp that they couldn't basically renegotiate or restructure his deal, but then at the same time turn around and gave the huge big money deal to a guy that never really truly deserved that kind of money in the first place. So by that particular time, Kemp was so angry about it that he basically threatened to sit out the entire year and basically held out a training camp for 22 days. All right. So even though he decided to came back during that season, he basically, his numbers dipped down a little bit. He averaged only 18.7 points per game. He played 81 games. Okay. He shot 51% from the field, 36% from the 3-point line, and shot 74% from the foul line. So he was still averaging his same numbers along with 10 rebounds. But that Sonics team was not as determined, and they were not as hungry at that particular point in time. But another thing that really hurt the Sonics in the long run is that the antics of George Karl was starting to rub off on the team. Okay. Now, when the Sonics brought in George Karl to take over for Casey Jones during the 91-92 season, okay, George Karl was basically a guy that was basically all over the league and wanted to have another opportunity to coach. Now, if you read, the book called Furious George, he basically came into a situation where the team was on the downside and they were trying to get a spark going. And then they eventually did and ended up going to the second round of the playoffs back in 92 before losing to the Jazz, okay? So by that time, okay, the Sonics were still an elite team, but they was not as hungry. They were not as determined as they were back in 96. It felt as if that the edge they had a year ago was gone. And Shawn Kemp, even though he still had an all-star year, he wasn't playing as assertive and as aggressive as he was the previous year. And you could pretty much contribute to the fact about the contract situation really messing up with his psyche a bit. And he was going through some stretches where he was not playing very well. He was getting into foul trouble. He was just not interested in playing at that particular point. And you could see it. So by the time the 96-97 offseason began, Shawn Kemp wanted out of Seattle. He did not want to be there anymore. He felt that the organization disrespected him, that by not renegotiating his contract, by not giving him the money that he deserved and giving it to somebody that never really truly earned it. And so he was part of a 3-team trade deal that basically sent him to the Cleveland Cavaliers. And what they got in return was Vin Baker. And, this is no disrespect to Vin Baker. He was basically a 3-time All-Star, but he was not Shawn Kemp. He was not the type of player that they could get you over the hump. And when the Sonics resumed play, honestly, the Seattle Supersonics didn't do as bad as many people thought they would. Now, they did win 57 games during Kemp's final season, but the next year they won 61 regular season games. This was a team that still has some of their core pieces of Payton, Hawkins, Schrempf, and Perkins. But they also added Dale Ellis, they added Jerome Hersey, and they added Greg Anthony, okay? And that team won 61 regular season games, but they had to go through another tough 5-game series. Again, another tough 5-game series, this time against the young and inexperienced Minnesota Timberwolves. And even though they survived that series in 5 games, they were not the same team after that. And then when they moved to the next round against the Lakers, they basically Shaq feasted on their weak front line. I mean, Jim McIlvaine and Sam Perkins, no disrespect to them, but they couldn't hold a lick against Shaquille O'Neal. And pretty much that series ended in 5 quick games. And by that period of time, George Karl's ego and his attitude was starting to rub off the organization and the players the wrong way. And his relationship with his general manager, Wally Walker, at the time was so bad that basically George was shown the door after the season concluded. And so in the course of 2 seasons, I should say 3 seasons, you basically made the NBA Finals, all right? But then you end up losing in the second round back-to-back seasons. And not only did you did not improve the roster, but you also got rid of the 2 main guys that got you there to the NBA Finals. So the reason why I felt that the Sonics, regressed as much as they did was because they tried to fix something that did not need to be fixed. Now, the center position was not their biggest strength. Now, that's not being said that they also had Sam Perkins there as their stretch five, but with Sam Perkins, he was not a physical player. He was more of a finesse player, as you guys understand. Okay, but having Jim McIlvaine on that team really was the straw that broke the camel's back, and it was ridiculous. There was no reason for them to even sign that guy in the first place, and when that happened, it began the downfall. And Gary Payton, still was playing at an all-star high level. He had one of his best seasons in 2000, leading them back to the playoffs in 2000 and then also in 2002. But about that period of time, there was no longer the same, Sonics team as they were years ago. They basically regressed from a, championship contending team to now a young rebuilding team built around Rashard Lewis and also with Desmond Mason at the time, before he got traded to Milwaukee along with Gary Payton for Ray Allen. And so I really think that when you look back, I think the management made a mistake of signing that contract to Jim McIlvaine, but also they did not improve the key area weaknesses. One of the weaknesses is that their backup point guard. Now, Nate McMillan, no disrespect to him, but the injuries were starting to pile up on him after 96. Now, remember, he had pulled his hamstring that basically hampered his back during the 96 series. That's why he was only able to play 2 games in that series. But the injuries were piling up, and then, Eric Snow was forced into play some key minutes into the playoffs. But also, I felt that the Sonics scheme and how they were running their offense was not as fluid. I felt that they were always too stagnant to a fault, and by that time, the Houston Rockets pretty much had the solution to handle the Seattle front line, and now it's Charles Barkley. And they pretty much figure out how to stop the trapping, defenses of George Karl. So I also really felt that, George Karl, took his job for granted, because everywhere he's been, his ego and his crazy attitude have always wanted to be the guy responsible for winning in any team. His ego drove him out of Seattle. It did the same thing. It happened in Milwaukee when he was in Denver, and obviously when he was in Sacramento for his final years there. So you could tell that the back record about George Karl. And you know what? For next week, I'm going to build a historical perspective on George Karl a little bit, though, too, because his is a very complicated issue. But that team, they were there. They were on the verge of winning a championship in 95, 96. They had the pieces there. They had the players to do it. They just didn't need to make any more changes. The only change they would need is maybe to improve the depth a little bit, but they didn't need to make wholesome changes. And you had to be sure to make Kemp happy. And even if you have to explain to him that we're going to renegotiate your contract next year, but not now, then he probably would understand. But for them to turn around and give Jim McIlvaine all that money, 7 years, $33 million. Are you kidding me? It is the worst deal I have ever seen. And to be honest with you, for any Sonics fan that is listening here, you can reflect on that deal and think about it. What the heck was Wally Walker thinking and giving him that deal? They were thinking they were getting the guy that could be a difference maker in the low post, a shot blocker, a rebounder, or something like that. But he was none of those things. And all he did was ate unnecessary salary. And he didn't even start, most of those games in the playoffs in 97. It was mostly Sam Perkins. And by the time Jim McIlvaine became a starter full time, he was completely ineffective. He did absolutely nothing for the Sonics, and he was just a waste. So at the end of the day, man, I'm going to conclude by this. Just poor contract signing, hurting egos, and then also not selling down the ego of George Karl pretty much was a downfall of that team. And by the time 98, 99 came around, there was no George Karl, no Shawn Kemp, and the other guys, Detlef, Schrempf, and Hersey, Hawkins, they left after that year. They went to different teams and then didn't look back. Obviously, Gary Payton went on to win a championship in 2006, and now is in the Hall of Fame. But you think about it, though, too. If that Sonics team would have stayed together, I think they could have won at least 1 or 2 championships heading into the next year. But let me know what you guys think in the comments section.